Story 1. My name is Tristan, and I'm an avid outdoorsman. Every year my dad would take me hiking as a reward for getting good grades at school. Since I adored it and the time I got to spend with my father, I made sure to be on top of my work. Around this time, I was 15 years old. After school let out, my dad picked me up, the car all packed with everything we needed. I walked around the side of the car, waving goodbye to my friends, when I noticed someone in the passenger seat, a lady I didn't recognize. Confused, I opened the door, greeting my father, and staring at the woman for a second, who flashed me this awkward smile. My father introduced her as Amelia, his new girlfriend. I was taken aback because he hadn't mentioned her before, like, ever. And we told each other everything, or at least I thought. Forgetting my manners for a second, I perked up and told her it was nice to meet her, shaking her hand and introducing myself. I remember her saying something else, but didn't really hear it. I know I was old enough to be grown up about it, but I was looking forward to it just being me and my dad, like it always was. But we were on the way already, so I had to get over it. Throughout the long car ride to our camping site, Amelia tried to make small talk, my dad awkwardly laughing any chance he got. I knew he could tell there was tension, but obviously didn't want to bring it up. I did my best to be kind, but after an hour or so, I put my headphones in and eventually fell asleep. I woke up about 10 minutes before we got there. Once we arrived, I helped my dad unload the bags. He was tasked with setting up booby traps around the outside of the camping area, something he started almost immediately because it was nearing dark. It was always my job to set up the tent, and I had gotten pretty good at it. Once I was done, Amelia loaded the inside with our sleeping bags. We had a quick dinner and zipped up the tent. Lights out. The tent was big enough for us all to fit, Amelia in the middle, and my dad and I on either side of her. For some reason that night, I couldn't get to sleep. I'm guessing they both fell asleep pretty early unless they were just laying there, but I just couldn't. My mom had died about 4 years ago at this point. I never really thought of her much on purpose, but that's all I could think of that night. I sat up and looked down at my dad and her. I understood why. It irritated me that it was affecting me this much. My head a ball of emotions, I silently unzipped the tent, stepping out into the night air. It immediately relaxed me. The moon was out slightly, so I could faintly see our camping area. I took in a deep breath. I could manage with Amelia. She seemed nice enough, and my dad appeared happy. As I was thinking over everything, I heard heavy breathing. And the direction it was coming from was near the tent, so I assumed it was my dad. The longer I sat, the louder it got. So I called over to him, and the breathing stopped. I stared at the tent for a short while and then got back in, zipping it back up and settling into my sleeping bag. The next morning I was woken up by my dad hollering for me, his tone serious. I yelled back, annoyed that he woke me up in such an obnoxious way. The tent was unzipped, so I stepped out. The sun was beaming, the air was crisp. Just as I started to enjoy the atmosphere, I felt my dad next to me, his hands running down me as if he was checking for something. I pushed him off me, my eyes still trying to adjust, but he yanked me towards him again, checking my arms and face. I asked him what his deal was, and he asked me if I had gone out that night. I told him I did, but only to sit for a while by the campfire. He gave me a look that I knew well. I was in trouble. But what for? "You know you're not supposed to go out at night. It could be dangerous," he said. But I didn't go far, only to the campfire. "Well, it doesn't look like it. And what did you cut yourself on? There's blood all around the tent." I froze and stared at him. I remembered everything that happened that night, and told him so. About everything, even his heavy breathing. As I was telling him, he walked me around the tent. There were clear footprints, but the way they were set into the ground was strange. It was as if someone was hopping on one foot, but sporadically around the campsite. The prints that did have 2 footprints, the right had drippings of blood in it, and on the back of the tent was a couple of drops of blood too. The whole scene was weird as hell. I reiterated my story again, but I could tell by the way my dad looked at me that he didn't believe me, which really hurt. My body had no bruises or cuts, so how he thought it was me, I still don't know why, still to this day. Maybe him believing it was me gave him an easier explanation to how bizarre the scene was. Either way, I was pissed. I explained to him again what had happened that night for the millionth time over breakfast, telling him again that the only odd thing was how heavy he was breathing that night. I was done explaining myself and stopped talking, almost to the point of tears. We sat in silence for a while. Then Amelia spoke up, saying that she woke up halfway through the night and my dad was sleeping quietly, asking how loud the sounds were. When I mimicked them, her face dropped, and she looked over at my dad. Jim, I don't think it was him, and I saw him go outside. He wasn't out for but a couple minutes. My dad didn't respond for a second, stone-faced. I think we should move to another spot, Jim. I don't like what's going on here. My dad dismissed the conversation, standing up and pulling on his pack. We all followed suit and began hiking, following the trail like we always did. I was relieved Amelia stuck up for me, but the trip was ruined for me, and I lagged behind. My dad was acting out of character. He never got mad at me that quickly, and was always open to listening to my side of things. But he seemed to be so pressed to make this trip special he allowed himself to make me the problem. Maybe he thought I was trying to sabotage the trip. We made it to a clearing that had a beautiful lake, which was our favorite spot that we fish at from time to time. When we got there, my dad pulled off his pack, handing me one of the fishing rods with a reassuring glance. I took it from him, rummaging in my bag trying to find the bait. I realized I hadn't packed it. With the argument my dad and I got into that morning, we didn't pack the essentials for fishing. I told my dad, who looked visibly upset, but he kept his tone light. He offered to go get the bait from the campsite and told us to stay where we were. Without another word, he headed back in the direction of the campsite, leaving me alone with Amelia. I watched him fade into the distance, and I sat on a near rock watching the lake. I didn't have the energy to act like I was okay. Amelia came over and stood by me in silence for a couple minutes. She slowly patted me on my back and apologized for my dad's temper. I told her it was all right, not saying anything else. I tried focusing on our surroundings to get me out of the funk I was in. The trickling of the water was comforting, and there was a light breeze again. I sat in the comfort as long as I could, till I noticed all the sounds had stopped. It was like someone threw a cloak over the forest, and it was quiet. I looked over at Amelia, and she looked just as confused as I did. I stared ahead of me, trying not to show I was nervous, when I heard a snapping of a branch to our right. I didn't bother to look, breathing a sigh of relief that we were hearing something. But there came another snap on top of another, all in equal succession. It surrounded the lake. I didn't know what animal hunted in that manner. Standing and shifting in front of Amelia, I began to think. My father taught me these things, what to look for in a predator, how to know if you're being stalked. This was all out of the ordinary for me. The supposed route of whatever we were hearing didn't make sense. I listened intently, waiting to hear a growl or see a big animal. I was staring off into the trees in the direction my dad left when I saw a woman off to the left of the clearing. She was older, looked to be in her 80s. She was wearing this beige dress. The right side of the dress was cut short to reveal a blood-soaked stump. I made eye contact with her, not knowing what to do. She looked real, not a ghost or a spirit. I could see her chest rise and fall, but her expression was unreadable. "Do you need help?" Amelia called out, which made me jump, me forgetting she was still there. The lady nodded her head and reached out an arm towards us. We slowly headed in her direction, Amelia close behind me. We got about 5 feet from her when I heard my dad's voice. I whipped my head around and saw him holding up the bait triumphantly. I heard a gasp behind me and turned back to see the lady gone. I was floored. This really was getting creepy. And now I had a witness, Amelia. My dad walked over looking worried. "What is wrong with you two? Did I take too long?" I stared up at him, not beginning to know what to say to him. "Yeah, we're fine, honey. We thought we saw a squirrel fall from its nest." She stepped in front of me, giving him a hug. My dad, accepting that excuse, walked back to the lake, his bait in hand. I followed them. I guess we weren't going to talk about it. I sat in silence for the majority of the fishing, talking enough to not cause attention to myself. I was trying to figure out what we had just seen. Amelia had seen it too. The lady was real, living, breathing. I know it for sure. I got close enough to her to see. Her wound was the only unsettling thing about her. And how she reached out. She clearly needed help. What didn't make sense was how quickly she disappeared. She only had one leg. There was no way she could have moved that fast in just a few seconds. But we all carried on like nothing was wrong. We fished for about an hour or two and headed back, me actually being able to catch a couple. We were coming up on our campsite again. I was lagging behind, the content of the day still deep in my mind, when I heard my dad curse loudly. "What?" I said, and leaned around him to see the campsite. All of our stuff was completely facing the opposite way it had been before we left. Everything sitting perfectly lined up, and our campfire was lit. Nothing appeared to be missing, just rearranged. The creepiest thing was our sleeping bags. They were laid out neatly with a bed of dirt at the heads and a small flower pressed into the center, like mini headstones or something. My father was losing his mind outside, yelling and cursing. Whoever did this was probably long gone, but he made a huge show of yelling into the evening, cursing and throwing out idle threats. The sun was setting, and it was an hour hike back to the car. We had to stay another night. My dad, on high alert, said he would stay up the entire night. The dirt and flowers he felt like was a message, a clear threat. We made and ate dinner in silence. My dad stoked the fire every couple of minutes. He sat a few feet away from the tent with his favorite machete in hand. It got tiring watching him be so alert. I understood our situation, but him being so high-strung scared me, more than I already was. With the light slowly fading, he told us to get some sleep, but his constant monitoring around the campsite kept me awake. I drifted off a few times, but was awake for the most part. When I finally did fall asleep, I was woken up by scuttling to the right side of the tent. It was loud and constant. Whatever this was running back and forth in this frenzy, like a dog chasing its tail. I looked over at Amelia, who was fast asleep. Me now thinking my dad was wrestling with some killer, I ran out of the tent. The noises went on for a couple more seconds and then stopped. My dad wasn't there. The campfire had slowly burned down. I looked around, calling out his name, and heard his voice a couple of feet away from me. I saw him come up the side of the trail. "Sorry, I went to take a leak." I broke down and told him what we had seen that day, adding on the scuttling part that had just happened. With wide eyes, he went to check the area. The area was covered in blood. The ground had been kicked up slightly. Leaves, blood, and dirt mixed in. This was too much blood, though, like an insane amount. Whatever this was should have been dead, but there was nothing there. My dad stepped away and told me to get back in the tent. Without another word, I spent the rest of the night up, with the tent unzipped so I could see my dad. Nothing else happened that night, but that morning we hauled it back up to the car. We didn't go back to that campsite for years. My dad reported everything when we got back home, but the police found nothing. I'm 33 writing this, and this story has stuck with me since then. I planned on going back up there to see if I could catch anything on camera, but my wife doesn't think it's a good idea. My name is Jane, and when I was around 20 years old, I went on a camping trip with my twin sister, Caroline. Caroline was always into the outdoors. Me, not so much. We had a particular spot she always liked setting up at. With a quick hike, we came to a clearing, and it was like something out of a fairy tale. The sun hit so pretty in the leaves, the birds were chirping lively. It made me rethink me not wanting to come. I wasn't much help getting everything prepped for us to spend the night. I didn't really know how to do anything, so I stood idly by while Caroline did everything. She had brought enough food for a day or two, but wanted us to try our luck fishing in the stream that was a couple yards away from our site. We tucked into some hot dogs and beans, talking about the trip and how I was getting used to being outside. I thought it was going to be scary when nighttime hit, but everything was so beautiful. All the stars were out lighting up the sky, I couldn't bring myself to sleep with how gorgeous everything was. I told Caroline I was going to stay out for a while and then join her later. She put out the fire and told me it would get cold soon and to zip up the tent when I came in. And she was right. It did get cold pretty quickly. I stayed out for about 15 more minutes and eventually went into the tent, snuggling into Caroline. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but was shaken awake by Caroline, saying she had to go to the bathroom but didn't want to go alone. I groggily sat up, and she pulled at me, gesturing to get up. Outside was cold and woke me up instantly. We walked a little ways away from the site, making sure it was an eyeshot. She went off into the bushes, and I stood there taking in the night. The area where we walked was a little darker, hidden by hanging trees. Here I did feel kind of scared. I couldn't see much, and Caroline was taking too long. I didn't know why I felt uneasy. I was scouring the trees when I saw something light up ahead of me. It was small, almost unnoticeable, and was half hidden by the trees when I saw it again. Me coming to the realization that it looked to be the end of a cigarette. The small red coals I could see, burning slightly. Someone was watching us. I slowly crouched down and shushed Caroline, who had just finished and was heading over to me. "There's someone over there," I whispered. Now my vision blocked, I couldn't see anything. We waited for what felt like an eternity before we heard snaps of branches and leaves, like whoever it was had walked away. We stayed put, giving it a little more time before heading back to the tent. The stars had gone, so it was as equally as dark near our tent. Relieved that maybe they didn't see our campsite. We hunkered down in the tent. We didn't know for certain what to do. We didn't know how long they had been there. And all at once the wonder of the trip in the forest left me, and I was afraid. Caroline told me we should watch in shifts, but sometime that night, we both fell asleep. I woke up, feeling out of sorts. My neck was stiff, and I could feel the ground under my back like my sleeping bag had shifted under me in the night. I could feel Caroline's head resting on my lower thigh, enjoying the warmth from her when I noticed my leg was soaked in something. I opened my eyes and saw the back of the tent ripped open, and to my utter horror and disgust, a woman's decapitated head. I shrieked and shifted backwards, screaming for Caroline. I got a clear view of the head and threw up, the head covered in blood. I stumbled out of the tent, screaming for Caroline. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, and I was very close to throwing up again, when I noticed a couple of feet away lay Caroline. She was face down, with horrible slashes across her back, her shirt ripped and tattered. I ran over to her screaming, calling out her name. My fingers shook so much I couldn't tell if she had a pulse. I threw her arm around my neck and half ran, half drug her up the road to our RV. I was able to get her laid down on the floor of it before tearing out of there, calling the cops, when we got far enough away. Caroline thankfully survived, not remembering much. When the police went back to investigate, they found a man in his late 40s, sitting in the middle of our campsite, the woman's head in his lap. He was arrested and sentenced. We never found out who the woman was, and frankly, I didn't want to know.